Welcome to Golden Years Bedtime Stories. Tonight, you won't hear noise, only the quiet story of a boy born in a log cabin who grew up to carry a divided nation, a life shaped by poverty, loss, and steady resilience. A man who knew failure, yet refused to surrender to it. Settle in, relax your mind, and let this true story of endurance and quiet strength carry you into restful sleep. True stories, untold strength, calm voices for restful nights. He did not arrive with destiny written into his name. No family legacy, no wealth, no protection. He was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, a place where life didn't promise anything except hardship. The cabin was crude. The floor was dirt. The walls barely held back winter. The cold didn't knock, it invaded. Hunger wasn't an emergency, it was routine. This was not the America of opportunity people like to imagine. This was the America that crushed people early and quietly. From the beginning, survival came before dreams. Lincoln's father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working man, but always one step behind disaster. Land was lost to legal disputes. Crops failed. Debt lingered. Stability never lasted long enough to feel real. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle and deeply religious, the emotional anchor of the family. In a world that demanded toughness, she gave young Abraham something rarer: warmth. But warmth does not stop hardship. The Lincoln family moved often, chasing land that might finally hold. Each move meant starting over, clearing forests by hand, building shelter from nothing, fighting soil that resisted every seed. Abraham was barely old enough to understand what was happening, but he felt it. Life was heavy, and it stayed that way. There was no childhood in the modern sense, no safety net, no room for weakness. From the moment he could carry weight, he was expected to contribute, not with chores, with labor, the kind that leaves blisters and silence behind. This was the first truth Lincoln learned. Nothing is given. Everything is earned or taken away. At night, by firelight, he listened more than he spoke. He watched adults argue about land, money, and survival. He learned how quickly hope could collapse, how fragile stability really was. There were no signs of greatness yet, no speeches, no leadership, no ambition anyone could recognize. Just a quiet boy in a harsh place, absorbing the lesson that life does not care who you are or how hard you try. And that lesson mattered, because when failure came later, when rejection followed him, when the country tore itself apart, when the weight of a nation landed on his shoulders, he would already understand something most leaders never learn. Survival is not heroic. It is exhausting. And Abraham Lincoln's story did not begin with greatness. It began with endurance. This was only the beginning. By the time he was old enough to understand words, He already understood work, not the kind that teaches responsibility, the kind that teaches endurance. His childhood unfolded on the edge of survival, where every day demanded effort just to stay even. When the Lincoln family moved from Kentucky to the Indiana frontier, the land offered no welcome. Dense forests had to be cleared before crops could be planted. Trees were felled by hand. Stumps were burned out slowly. The soil resisted everything, and Abraham was expected to help. From sunrise to sunset, he worked beside grown men, hauling wood, splitting rails, plowing ground frozen stiff with cold. There was no exemption for youth. Strength mattered more than age. Fatigue didn't excuse failure. While other children learned through books, Lincoln learned through strain. He learned how muscles give out, how cold settles into bones, how exhaustion becomes normal. School existed, but barely. Formal education came in fragments. Short sessions held in crude schoolhouses, taught by teachers who were often only slightly more educated than their students. Lincoln's total schooling added up to perhaps a single year across his entire childhood. 1 year, that was it. There were no desks, no structure, no encouragement. Learning was something you took for yourself if you had the energy left after work. And Abraham wanted it. He borrowed books whenever he could find them. He read by firelight, by candle, by whatever glow he could steal from the night after long days of labor. He read slowly, deliberately, often rereading the same pages because books were rare and memory mattered. Reading became escape and weapon. Words offered something the frontier did not, possibility. But even that came with tension. His father did not value education. Thomas Lincoln believed work built character, not books. Abraham's hunger for learning felt impractical, even indulgent. There were moments when books were taken from him, when reading was seen as laziness. This conflict cut deep. Lincoln learned early that curiosity could isolate you, that wanting more could make you stand alone. And yet, he refused to let go of it. He didn't know where learning would take him. He only knew he needed it. This chapter of Lincoln's life was quiet, almost invisible in history, but it mattered deeply. It built his patience, his discipline, his habit of thinking while others slept. It taught him that progress rarely comes from permission. It comes from persistence. He was not gifted advantages. He was shaped by resistance. And long before he faced public rejection, political defeat, or national collapse, he learned how to survive being overlooked, how to grow in silence, while the world expected nothing from him. This was not greatness yet. This was preparation. In the autumn of 1818, death arrived without warning, and it did not leave quickly. The disease they called milk sickness crept through the Indiana frontier like a shadow. No one understood it. Cows grazed on poisoned plants. Families drank the milk. People fell ill, never recovered. He was 9 years old when his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, became sick. At first, it didn't seem fatal. Weakness, fever, pain that lingered longer than it should. But days passed, and she worsened. The cabin that once felt cramped now felt suffocating. The woman who had been the emotional center of the family, the voice of calm, faith, and kindness, began to fade in front of her children. There was no doctor, no medicine, only waiting. On October 5, 1818, Nancy Hanks Lincoln died. She was just 34 years old. For Abraham, the loss was not just personal, it was disorienting. His mother had been the one who encouraged his reading, who spoke gently when the world was harsh, who believed there was something more in him, even when nothing around them suggested it. And suddenly, she was gone. The frontier did not pause for grief. The work still needed to be done. The cabin still needed tending. Winter was coming. Survival demanded attention, even when the heart could not keep up. Abraham helped bury his mother on a nearby hill, marked only by a wooden stake. No ceremony, no final words, just earth and silence. That silence followed him. Those close to Lincoln later noticed something change after his mother's death. He grew quieter, more inward, thoughtful to the point of melancholy. He learned to carry emotion instead of releasing it. This was his first encounter with loss, and it carved deep. For more than a year, the Lincoln home lacked warmth in every sense. His older sister, Sarah, tried to fill the void, but she was still a child herself. Thomas Lincoln struggled. The absence of Nancy was felt in every corner of daily life. Then, unexpectedly, relief came in the form of a woman named Sarah Bush Johnston. She arrived as Lincoln's stepmother in 1819, and with her came stability. She brought furniture, books, order, but more importantly, she brought kindness. She noticed Abraham's hunger for learning and encouraged it instead of suppressing it. Lincoln would later say she was the best friend he ever had. Still, the damage had been done. The early loss of his mother shaped how Lincoln understood the world. It taught him that love could vanish suddenly, that security was fragile, that life could be unfair without explanation. It also taught him empathy. He had felt helplessness firsthand, and he never forgot it. Decades later, as president, Lincoln would sit with grieving families, write letters to parents who had lost sons in war, speak of sorrow in a way that felt earned, not rehearsed. That voice, soft, restrained, deeply human, was born the day he lost his mother. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. Instead, it became the moment that quietly shaped the man who would one day carry the grief of an entire nation. Loss did not break Abraham Lincoln. It taught him how to hold pain and keep going. If Abraham Lincoln's childhood taught him how to endure pain, his early adulthood taught him something far more unsettling. Hard work does not guarantee success. By his early 20s, Lincoln was no longer a boy surviving on the frontier. He was a young man trying desperately to find direction in a world that offered no clear path. America was expanding. Opportunity was supposed to be everywhere. But for Lincoln, every step forward seemed to lead straight into another wall. In 1831, he moved to the small village of New Salem, Illinois, carrying little more than physical strength, curiosity, and the quiet belief that he might be capable of more. At first, there were signs of promise. People noticed him, his height, his humor, his intelligence. He worked as a store clerk and quickly gained a reputation for honesty. Locals trusted him. That trust would soon be tested. In 1832, Lincoln partnered in a general store, his first attempt at business ownership. It felt like a turning point, a chance to stand on his own, a chance to prove that survival could turn into stability. It failed. Bad location, economic downturns, inexperience. The store collapsed, leaving Lincoln buried under debt. While others walked away, Lincoln refused to escape responsibility. He took on the debt himself, a crushing burden that would follow him for years. He later called it his national debt. It wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Failure followed him everywhere. That same year, riding on a wave of local popularity and confidence, Lincoln made another bold move. He ran for the Illinois state legislature. He lost. Badly. The rejection was public, unavoidable, the kind that echoes. He was forced to face a painful truth. Being liked is not the same as being chosen. Then came war. During the Black Hawk War, Lincoln volunteered and was elected captain by his fellow soldiers, a small but meaningful moment of validation. Yet the war itself offered no glory, no battlefield triumph, only confusion, hardship, and anticlimax. When it ended, Lincoln returned home without distinction and without direction. By his mid-20s, he had no stable career, no money, and no clear future. And then came the blow that nearly broke him. In 1835, Lincoln's close friend and romantic interest, Anne Rutledge, died suddenly from illness. Her death devastated him. Those around him feared for his mental health. He withdrew. He spiraled into what many historians believe was a deep depressive episode. This was not poetic sadness. This was collapse. The pressure was relentless. Financial debt, emotional loss, public rejection. Lincoln stood at a crossroads where many men simply disappear into bitterness, mediocrity, or silence. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. But something unusual happened. Instead of retreating, Lincoln reflected. He examined his failures with brutal honesty. He acknowledged his lack of preparation, his lack of structure, his scattered ambition, and slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild not externally, but internally. he returned to study law, history, logic, rhetoric. He read not because it was inspiring, but because he needed answers. He needed discipline. He needed a foundation strong enough to carry the weight he kept failing under. In 1834, against expectation and memory of defeat, Lincoln ran for the Illinois legislature again. This time he won. The victory was modest, but it mattered, not because it erased failure, but because it proved something critical. Failure was not final. Yet, even this success did not lift him into confidence. Lincoln carried his doubts forward. He remained painfully aware of how quickly things could fall apart. He distrusted easy victories. He expected resistance. That mindset formed here, in debt and grief, would later define his leadership. He learned that setbacks were not interruptions to life. They were the substance of it. He did not stumble into greatness by accident. He was forged in disappointment. Long before he faced national crisis, he learned how to stand after collapse, how to live with loss, how to keep moving forward when there was no applause, no certainty, and no guarantee that effort would be rewarded. It was about staying alive mentally, emotionally, morally, when success seemed like a myth. And the struggle was only getting started. There was no moment when he suddenly decided to become great. No dramatic vow. No mentor pointing the way. What there was instead was something quieter and far more dangerous. A man alone with his doubts, determined not to remain small. By his mid-20s, Lincoln had tasted enough failure to know this truth. Raw strength and honesty were not enough. The world did not reward effort, it rewarded preparation. And if he was going to survive beyond the frontier, he would have to build himself from the inside out. So he did something radical for a man of his background. He studied, not in a school, not under a professor, but in stolen hours with borrowed books, by firelight and exhaustion. Lincoln's formal education had ended almost before it began, but his real education was just starting. He read everything he could get his hands on. Law books, biographies, Shakespeare, the Bible, Euclid's Elements. He didn't skim, he absorbed. He copied passages by hand. He rewrote ideas in his own words until he understood them completely. This wasn't curiosity. This was survival. He knew what it felt like to be underestimated. He knew how it felt to walk into a room already dismissed. Knowledge became his armor. Language became his weapon. But learning did not come easily. There were nights when fatigue won, days when self-doubt screamed louder than ambition. Lincoln was painfully aware of his background, how he spoke, how he dressed, how little formal training he had compared to others who seemed effortlessly confident. Imposter syndrome before it had a name. And yet, he kept going. What drove him was not ego, it was fear. Fear of stagnation. Fear of becoming another forgotten man crushed by circumstance. fear that his life would end exactly where it started. This internal pressure shaped everything about him. He practiced thinking clearly, practiced arguing both sides of an issue, practiced listening before speaking. Over time, people noticed something unusual. Lincoln didn't just talk, he reasoned. He could strip a problem down to its core and rebuild it logically. This was not talent, it was discipline. In 1836, Lincoln formally committed to studying law. With no law school, no guidance, and no connections, he taught himself the profession from scratch. He passed the bar in 1837, against all odds. But even that victory was fragile. He entered the legal world awkward, self-conscious, painfully aware that he did not belong to the polished elite. His appearance was ungainly, his confidence uneven. He lost cases, he made mistakes, he doubted himself constantly. Still, he learned, not just the law but people, their motives, their fears, their contradictions. He listened to farmers, laborers, merchants, and widows. He learned how injustice felt at ground level, not in theory. This mattered because Lincoln was not building ambition for power. He was building capacity, the capacity to argue clearly, to persuade without cruelty, to disagree without dehumanizing. This chapter of his life was invisible to most. No headlines, no recognition, just a man quietly sharpening himself while the world passed by. But it was here, deep in self-education and isolation, that Lincoln developed the tools he would later use to face a nation tearing itself apart. This was not the rise yet. This was the forging, and forging hurts. Lincoln never forgot where he came from. He never pretended his past didn't exist. Instead, he turned it into fuel, proof that a man could rebuild himself, piece by piece, through effort, humility, and relentless learning. Greatness wasn't calling him yet, but he was preparing himself to answer when it did. He did not walk into the legal profession with confidence. He walked in with uncertainty, self-awareness, and a constant fear of being exposed. By the late 1830s, Lincoln had passed the bar and begun practicing law in Illinois. But nothing about his presence suggested authority. He was tall to the point of awkwardness. His clothes were ill-fitting, his posture unsure. In courtrooms filled with polished men trained in formal schools, Lincoln stood out for all the wrong reasons, and he knew it. Every case felt like a test, not just of his legal knowledge, but of his right to be there at all. He made mistakes early. He lost arguments. He stumbled over procedure. There were moments when his lack of formal education showed, and he felt the sting of judgment from peers who believed the law belonged to them, not to a former rail splitter. The pressure was relentless, but Lincoln didn't try to imitate them. He did something different. Instead of focusing on appearance, he focused on clarity. He stripped arguments down to their essence. He spoke plainly. He avoided theatrical tricks. When he spoke, juries listened not because he sounded impressive, but because he sounded honest. Slowly, something shifted. Lincoln became known not as the sharpest dresser, but as the most trustworthy man in the room. Judges respected him. Clients relied on him. Even opponents admitted something rare. Lincoln argued to win, but never at the expense of truth. That mattered to him. He hated manipulation. He distrusted ambition that ignored morality. In one case after another, Lincoln refused clients he believed were wrong, even when money was scarce. This was not strategic. It was instinctive and costly. He often lived modestly. Financial stability remained fragile. But his reputation grew not in speed, but in depth. Then came the circuit. Illinois lawyers traveled long distances to serve multiple counties, riding horseback for weeks at a time. Lincoln joined them, sleeping in taverns, sharing meals, listening to stories. On the road, he learned America, not the idealized version, but the fractured reality. Farmers drowning in debt. Families torn apart by land disputes. Men crushed by contracts they didn't understand. Lincoln absorbed it all. The law, for him, was no longer abstract. It was human, messy, moral. These years hardened him, but they also softened him. He developed empathy without sentimentality, humor without cruelty, firmness without arrogance. Yet beneath the growing competence, doubt never left. Lincoln battled recurring depression. Long stretches of melancholy haunted him. He questioned his worth. He feared public failure. He worried that his ambition was misplaced, that he was reaching beyond his station. Still, he stayed, case by case, county by county, year by year. This was not a meteoric rise. It was accumulation. And it mattered more than anyone realized. Because the courtroom became Lincoln's training ground for something larger. Here, he learned how to argue under pressure, how to listen without interrupting, how to persuade without humiliating. He learned how to stand in conflict and not break. By the time he began to consider returning seriously to politics, Lincoln was no longer just a man with ambition. He was a man with tools. He had learned discipline through failure, logic through study, humanity through law, and above all, he had learned how to survive spaces that were not designed for him. But it was essential, because before Lincoln could argue for a nation's future, he had to learn how to argue for truth, one ordinary case at a time. And he did. He did not step into politics because he craved power. He stepped in because he believed, quietly, stubbornly, that things could be argued into being better. By the late 1830s, Lincoln had built a modest but respectable life as a lawyer in Illinois. He was no longer the lost young man drifting through New Salem. He had a profession, a reputation, a growing ability to persuade. But beneath that stability burned a deeper restlessness. He He had seen too much. He had watched ordinary people crushed by systems they didn't understand. He had argued cases where the law was technically correct but morally hollow. He had listened to men talk about progress while leaving others behind. Politics, to Lincoln, was not glamour, it was leverage. And leverage comes with consequences. His first serious step into public office had already ended in failure. In 1832, when he ran for the Illinois state legislature for the first time, he lost badly. The defeat was humbling, almost embarrassing. He was young, inexperienced, and unprepared for how indifferent the public could be. But Lincoln did not retreat. In 1834, he ran again. This time he won. The victory felt fragile, almost accidental, but it mattered. It proved that rejection did not have to be permanent. That persistence could, sometimes, bend reality. Lincoln was elected as a Whig representative, and soon found himself immersed in the rough, unromantic world of state politics. It was not inspiring. Illinois politics was chaotic, petty, and deeply transactional. Alliances shifted quickly. Ambition mattered more than integrity. Loud voices often drowned out thoughtful ones. Lincoln entered this environment with idealism and immediately paid for it. He spoke too carefully. He hesitated when others attacked. He believed logic would prevail where power ruled. He was wrong. Still, he learned. Over multiple terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln became known as capable but unremarkable. Not charismatic, not dominant, not feared. He struggled to stand out. His anti-slavery sentiments, still cautious, still evolving, made him uncomfortable to some and untrustworthy to others. Failure followed him everywhere. In 1846, Lincoln aimed higher and ran for the U.S. House of Representatives. He won, but the victory would quickly sour. In Congress, Lincoln opposed the Mexican-American War, questioning its moral justification. It was the right stance, historically, but politically, it was disastrous. The war was popular. Lincoln's criticism branded him as unpatriotic, weak, out of touch. His support collapsed. When his term ended, there was no appetite to keep him in Washington. He returned to Illinois politically damaged, his reputation bruised, his future uncertain. Once again, the door closed. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. Lincoln was approaching his 40s. He had failed more times than he had succeeded. His political career looked stalled, possibly finished. Younger men were rising. Louder men, sharper men. Men who did not doubt themselves the way Lincoln always did. For several years, he stepped back from politics entirely. He focused on law, on survival, on keeping disappointment from turning into bitterness. Friends worried he had disappeared for good. But Lincoln was watching, always watching. In the 1850s, the country began to fracture more visibly. The issue of slavery, long avoided, compromised, delayed, refused to stay buried. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 shattered the uneasy balance, allowing territories to vote on whether to permit slavery. Lincoln was outraged, not theatrically, but profoundly. This was not abstract anymore. This was moral ground shifting beneath the nation's feet. And something in Lincoln snapped awake. The careful, cautious politician gave way to a man willing to speak clearly, risk included. He returned to politics with renewed urgency. But urgency did not mean success. He ran for the U.S. Senate in 1855 and lost again. This time, the defeat came through political maneuvering rather than public vote. Deals were made behind closed doors. Power flowed where it always had. Lincoln watched himself lose not because of argument, but because of arithmetic. The rejection cut deep. And yet, instead of withdrawing, Lincoln sharpened his voice. He began speaking more publicly, more forcefully, more morally. He framed slavery not as a political inconvenience, but as a fundamental contradiction in American ideals. In 1858, Lincoln ran for the Senate again, this time against Stephen A. Douglas, one of the most powerful political figures in the country. What followed would define him. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were brutal, public, and unforgiving. 7 debates across Illinois. Crowds, newspapers, national attention. Lincoln stood tall physically and intellectually against a seasoned opponent. He lost the election, again. And yet, paradoxically, this loss changed everything. Lincoln's arguments reached far beyond Illinois. His clarity, his restraint, his refusal to demonize while still condemning injustice. People noticed. Newspapers carried his words east. His reputation grew not as a winner, but as a man of substance. This chapter of his life was filled with contradiction. He lost elections, but gained influence. He was rejected publicly, but recognized privately. He failed upward slowly, painfully, without guarantees. The pressure was relentless. Each defeat reinforced the risk of believing in something larger than yourself. Each loss invited the same question: is this worth it? Lincoln never answered it directly. He just kept going. By the end of the decade, he was no longer invisible. He was no longer dismissed. He was not powerful, but he was positioned. And all of it had been earned through failure. Politics did not crown Abraham Lincoln. It tested him. It humiliated him. It taught him how fragile public approval really is, and how dangerous it is to depend on it. By surviving repeated rejection without becoming cruel, arrogant, or cynical, Lincoln proved something rare. He could lose and still stand. And that would matter more than any victory that came next. By the end of the 1850s, he was known across America, but not as a winner. He was known as the man who kept losing. That reputation followed him everywhere. Newspapers described him as awkward. Opponents mocked his appearance. Political insiders dismissed him as earnest but unrealistic. He had lost elections that mattered, returned home defeated, and watched others, louder, sharper, more ruthless, rise past him. And the danger wasn't just failure. It was becoming defined by it. Lincoln felt it deeply. He felt the weight of time pressing against him. He was no longer young. His peers were consolidating power, building networks, securing legacies. Meanwhile, he stood in a strange place, visible, but not victorious. The pressure was relentless. After losing the 1858 Senate race to Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln did not retreat quietly, but he also did not celebrate. He returned to his law practice with the same discipline he always had, riding the circuit, arguing cases, listening to ordinary Americans who had no idea they were speaking to a man one step away from national relevance. This double life was exhausting. By day, he was a working lawyer. By night, a man replaying defeats in his mind. Depression never fully left him. Friends noticed his dark moods, long silences, jokes used as shields. He carried what he called his melancholy, like an old injury manageable, but always there. And yet, something critical was happening beneath the surface. Lincoln's losses had freed him. He no longer needed to impress party elites. He no longer believed quick success was possible. What he had left was clarity about who he was and what he stood for. And what he stood for was becoming increasingly unpopular in parts of the country. The nation was unraveling. Violence in Kansas, court rulings like Dred Scott declaring Black Americans had no rights white men were bound to respect. Compromises collapsing under their own contradictions. Lincoln spoke out not as a firebrand, but as a moral witness. He warned that the country could not endure permanently half slave and half free. The words were calm but explosive. Some heard conviction. Others heard threat. Many heard danger. Lincoln knew the cost. Every speech risked alienation. Every position risked permanent exile from power. He was painfully aware that being right did not mean being rewarded. This was the loneliest stretch of his life. He watched friends choose safety over principle. He saw politicians adjust their beliefs to fit the room. He listened to men justify cruelty as compromise, and he refused to join them. That refusal came with isolation. There were nights when Lincoln wondered if he had misjudged himself, if his insistence on moral clarity had doomed him to irrelevance, if history would pass him by while he stood still, holding convictions no one wanted to carry. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart, but failure had already taken everything from him except integrity. And that mattered. As the Republican Party began forming out of fractured opposition to slavery's expansion, Lincoln was not an obvious choice for leadership. He lacked executive experience. He lacked charisma. He lacked a clean win record. What he had instead was credibility. He had been tested publicly and had not broken. He had spoken hard truths and survived backlash. He had lost power and had not abandoned principle. In a political climate defined by extremes, Lincoln's steadiness began to look like strength. Slowly, quietly, the narrative shifted. Newspapers revisited his debates. Party leaders reread his speeches, not because he had triumphed, but because he had endured, because he sounded like someone who understood loss, conflict, and restraint. The man once dismissed as unelectable now seemed necessary. Lincoln did not know this yet. He continued living as if defeat were permanent, continued working, continued thinking, continued preparing without expectation, and that preparation, shaped by rejection, doubt, and emotional fatigue, built something rare in him: resilience without bitterness. When others hardened, he softened. When others shouted, he reasoned. When others chased victory, he prepared for responsibility. Failure had not elevated Lincoln. It had educated him. And when the moment finally came, when the nation would look for someone who could hold pressure without cracking his years of public loss, would become the very reason he was trusted. It was about endurance. Because before Lincoln could lead a divided nation, he had to learn how to live with being dismissed by it. And he did, quietly, relentlessly, without breaking. There are moments in a life when neutrality stops being an option. Moments when silence becomes a choice, and a dangerous one. For Abraham Lincoln, that moment did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, carried by court decisions, broken compromises, and the steady normalization of injustice. Slavery had always existed in the background of his world, woven into America's economic and political fabric. For years, Lincoln approached it cautiously, even reluctantly opposing its spread, but avoiding the language of abolition. Not because he lacked conviction, but because he understood the cost. America was a fragile union. One wrong move could shatter it. And Lincoln knew that moral certainty without strategic restraint could do as much damage as cowardice. But by the mid-1850s, restraint was no longer protecting anything worth saving. The first major shock came with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. It repealed the Missouri Compromise, allowing new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. On paper, it sounded democratic. In reality, it unleashed chaos. Violence erupted. Families fled. Armed men fought over ballots and borders. Lincoln watched this unfold with growing alarm. To him, the issue was no longer abstract. This was not about regional preference or political balance. This was about whether America still believed in its own founding principle, that all men are created equal, or whether that phrase had always been conditional, he returned to public speaking with urgency. Not anger, not theatrics, but clarity. Lincoln argued that slavery was not just a Southern problem, it was a national moral failure, that allowing its expansion wasn't compromise, it was surrender, and that the country was lying to itself if it believed it could contain an injustice without becoming complicit in it. The backlash was immediate. He was called naive, dangerous, a radical in disguise. Others accused him of hypocrisy, pointing out that he did not call for immediate abolition everywhere. Lincoln didn't deny the complexity. He didn't pretend to be perfect, but he refused to pretend slavery was acceptable. Then came the Dred Scott decision in 1857. The Supreme Court ruled that Black Americans, enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no rights white men were bound to respect. It declared that Congress had no authority to restrict slavery in the territories. Legally final, morally devastating. For Lincoln, this ruling crossed a line. It wasn't just about slavery anymore. It was about whether the law itself had been severed from justice, whether the Constitution was being used to protect freedom or to rationalize cruelty. Lincoln spoke out forcefully. He challenged the logic of the decision, exposing its contradictions. He argued that if the court could declare an entire class of people outside the protection of the law, then no one's rights were safe. This was risky. Openly criticizing the Supreme Court was not common and not popular, but Lincoln understood something many politicians avoided. If institutions lose their moral compass, someone has to say it out loud. His most defining moment came during the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858. Standing before crowds across Illinois, Lincoln articulated his position with painful precision. He did not claim racial equality in the modern sense. That would have been politically fatal. But he did insist on something radical for the time: that Black Americans were entitled to the same natural rights as any human being. The right to live, the right to liberty, the right to the fruits of their labor. And he said something that echoed across the nation. A house divided against itself cannot stand. The country, he warned, could not endure permanently half slave and half free. It would become all one thing or all the other. People heard threat in his words. Others heard truth. Douglas accused him of inciting division. Newspapers twisted his statements. Crowds heckled. Allies urged him to soften his language. Lincoln refused. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. He knew taking a moral stand could destroy what little political future he had left. He knew the country wasn't ready. He knew compromise would be easier and safer. But he also knew this: some truths don't wait for permission. Lincoln's stance on slavery was not rooted in moral grandstanding. It was rooted in empathy, in the memory of his own poverty in the stories he'd heard on the legal circuit, in the quiet conviction that no system built on human ownership could ever be stable or just. And yet, he carried this conviction with restraint. He rejected violence. He rejected dehumanization. He rejected hatred. He believed slavery was wrong, but he also believed the nation had to be saved. This balance, moral clarity without cruelty, made him difficult to categorize. Too firm for moderates, too cautious for abolitionists, too principled for opportunists. But it made him real. As the country moved closer to fracture, Lincoln's words began circulating beyond Illinois. Eastern Republicans read his speeches. Party leaders took note, not because he promised victory, but because he sounded like someone who understood the weight of consequences. He was not chasing applause. He was preparing for responsibility. Slavery forced Lincoln to confront the limits of patience, to choose between political survival and moral truth. And when that choice became unavoidable, he chose the harder path. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but deliberately. It was about resolve. Lincoln knew that once you name an injustice clearly, you cannot unsee it. You cannot retreat to comfort. You cannot pretend neutrality is harmless. By standing against slavery, not with rage, but with reason, Lincoln placed himself on a collision course with history. And history was accelerating. The country was tearing itself apart. And the man who had spent a lifetime losing was about to be tested in ways no election could prepare him for. Because when moral conviction meets national crisis, survival is no longer personal. It becomes collective, and he was walking straight into it. By 1860, the United States was no longer arguing about the future. It was bracing for impact. The country was split along lines that no compromise could fully hide: North versus South, free labor versus slavery, Union versus secession. Every conversation felt sharp. Every newspaper sounded like a warning. Trust between regions had eroded to the point where even words were treated like weapons. And in the middle of this tension stood Abraham Lincoln, still not the obvious choice. He was not the most famous Republican. He was not the most experienced. He was not the most radical. He was, however, something else. He was acceptable to enough people and threatening to enough others to matter. Lincoln entered the presidential race quietly, almost cautiously. There was no grand announcement tour, no overwhelming confidence. He understood his position better than anyone. One wrong move could end everything. A careless phrase could be used as proof that he was dangerous, reckless, or secretly extreme. The pressure was relentless. Inside the Republican Party, rivals circled. Men with stronger resumes, governors, senators, established power brokers. Lincoln was viewed as a compromise candidate, a man who might hold the party together without igniting panic. That label didn't flatter him, but it didn't insult him either. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln did not dominate the room. He waited. Delegates argued. Deals were made. Frontrunners stumbled. The convention dragged on through ballot after ballot, tension rising with each round. And then, quietly, the math shifted. Lincoln began picking up votes, not because he inspired the most passion, but because he offended the fewest people. He was firm on slavery's expansion, without calling for immediate abolition everywhere. He spoke morally, but not recklessly. He seemed steady. On the third ballot, he became the Republican nominee for President of the United States. Against all odds, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Southern states did not wait for the election. They saw Lincoln's nomination as a threat to their way of life, their economy, their power. Newspapers declared his victory would mean ruin. Politicians warned of secession. Violence simmered beneath the surface. Lincoln watched it unfold with grim awareness. He did not celebrate loudly. He did not promise easy solutions. He understood that his candidacy had become a symbol, whether he wanted it or not. To some, he represented hope. To others, catastrophe. The campaign that followed was unlike anything America had seen. Lincoln did not travel the country. He did not give speeches daily. Instead, he stayed largely silent, allowing others to argue for and against him. His words were measured, rare, and precise. He knew the country was listening too closely for mistakes. Opponents attacked him relentlessly. They called him inexperienced, a dangerous idealist, a hidden abolitionist intent on destroying the South. His appearance was mocked, his background dismissed, his intentions distorted. The Democratic Party split apart under the pressure, running multiple candidates and exposing just how fractured the nation had become. Lincoln watched as the election turned less into a contest of policies and more into a referendum on America's future. On November 6, 1860, he won the presidency. He did not win a majority of the popular vote. He won because the country itself was divided beyond repair. The victory felt hollow. 7 southern states announced their intention to secede before Lincoln even took office. Others followed. Federal forts were seized. Militias formed. The Union was unraveling in real time. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. Lincoln was president-elect, but powerless. He could not issue orders. He could not stop the collapse. He could only watch as the nation slid toward war while he waited to assume office. The weight was unbearable. Privately, Lincoln wrestled with fear. Fear that he was not equal to what lay ahead. Fear that his election had triggered destruction. Fear that history would blame him for a war he had not yet begun. And yet, he refused to panic. He spoke carefully, appealed for calm. reaffirmed his commitment to preserving the Union. He did not threaten. He did not surrender. He tried desperately to hold the country together with words while time slipped away. When Lincoln finally took the oath of office in March 1861, the country he inherited was already breaking. But he stood there anyway, tall, awkward, somber, a man shaped by failure, now facing a crisis no amount of preparation could fully contain. He had won the election, but the real fight, the one that would define survival itself, was just beginning. Because leadership, Lincoln was about to learn, is not proven by victory. It is tested by collapse, and the nation was collapsing fast. He became president at the worst possible moment. By the time he took the oath of office in March 1861, the United States was already unraveling. 7 southern states had seceded. Federal authority in large parts of the country was collapsing. The Union existed more on paper than in practice. And Lincoln, awkward, self-taught, and untested at the executive level, was now responsible for holding it together. The pressure was immediate, and it was merciless. His first days in office were not marked by bold action, but by restraint. Every decision carried the risk of war. Every delay carried the risk of weakness. If he moved too aggressively, he would push more states into secession. If he did nothing, the Union would dissolve quietly, permanently. There was no safe path. Then came Fort Sumter. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on the federal fort in Charleston Harbor. It was a direct challenge to national authority. When the fort fell, the illusion that compromise could still work collapsed with it. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln did not celebrate resolve. He felt the weight of it. He called for troops, not out of anger, but necessity. And the response was explosive. More southern states seceded. The nation split fully in two. Brothers turned against brothers, neighbors against neighbors. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart, and in many ways it did. Lincoln was now a wartime president with no military experience, commanding generals who often doubted him, leading a country that did not fully trust him. Newspapers criticized his every move. Congress challenged his authority. The public demanded victories he could not deliver quickly. Early battles were disasters. Union forces suffered humiliating defeats at Bull Run, exposing how unprepared the North truly was. Morale plummeted. Confidence in Lincoln's leadership wavered. Some openly called for his removal. Others mocked him as weak, indecisive, or overwhelmed. Privately, Lincoln agonized. He read casualty reports late into the night. Thousands dead, tens of thousands wounded, lives erased by decisions that ultimately led back to his desk. The cost of leadership became brutally clear. This was not theory. This was blood. Lincoln faced another crisis few leaders survive: incompetent generals. He cycled through commanders, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, men with talent, but also ego, hesitation, or recklessness. Some refused to fight. Others fought poorly. Lincoln wrote letters urging action, patience wearing thin. At times, he felt alone. He could not rely on easy answers. He could not trust blind loyalty. He had to learn military strategy on the job, reading maps, studying tactics, questioning experts who resented his interference. And still, the war dragged on. The country was tearing itself apart, exactly as he had warned. Civil liberties were strained. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in some areas, a deeply controversial move. Critics accused him of dictatorship. Supporters argued it was necessary for survival. Lincoln himself did not pretend it was comfortable. He understood the danger of power, even when used for preservation. At the same time, he carried personal grief. His young son, Willie Lincoln, died in 1862, likely of typhoid fever. The White House, already heavy with war, became a place of mourning. Lincoln was devastated. He withdrew into silence, his long-standing depression deepening. And yet, he did not stop. Every morning, he returned to work. He visited wounded soldiers in hospitals, shook hands with men missing limbs, listened to stories of suffering without turning away. These moments were not ceremonial, they were grounding. They reminded him who the war was for and what failure would mean. As the war continued, Lincoln's leadership evolved. He became firmer, more decisive, less concerned with appeasing critics. He began to understand that survival of the Union, of democracy itself, required endurance, not perfection. Slowly, progress emerged. Union victories at Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg shifted momentum. Each came at enormous cost. Each confirmed that there would be no clean ending, no quick resolution. Lincoln adjusted strategy. He elevated Ulysses S. Grant, a general who understood something others did not. Wars are won by persistence, by pressure, by refusing to stop. Grant's style matched Lincoln's own philosophy, grinding, costly, but honest about reality. Still, the war tested Lincoln's spirit daily. Letters poured in. Some begged for mercy. Others cursed his name. Mothers demanded to know why their sons had died. Politicians urged him to quit, to compromise, to accept division. Lincoln listened, and then he carried on. Leadership, he learned, is not about being liked. It is about being responsible, about absorbing anger, grief, and fear without letting them dictate action. By the later years of the war, Lincoln had become something different from the man who entered office. Not harder, but steadier. Not louder, but clearer. He no longer doubted the necessity of the fight, even as it exhausted him. He no longer imagined an easy peace. He prepared for a long, painful reckoning. This chapter of Lincoln's life was defined by impossible choices, by nights without sleep, by decisions that killed thousands so millions might remain free. It was leadership stripped of romance, and yet through the chaos, something remarkable held. The Union did not collapse, not yet, because at the center of the storm stood a man who had spent his entire life learning how not to break when everything around him did. He did not command the Civil War with brilliance. He endured it, and sometimes endurance is the highest form of leadership. He did not free the slaves in a moment of triumph. He did it in a moment of desperation. By the summer of 1862, the Civil War had become something far darker than anyone imagined. Casualties mounted by the tens of thousands. The Union Army bled victories and defeats in equal measure. Public patience was thinning. International powers watched closely, weighing whether the American experiment was worth supporting or whether it was already finished. Lincoln felt the ground shifting beneath him. The war had begun as a fight to preserve the Union, but as bodies piled up, a harder question pressed in from every direction. What was all this blood for? Behind closed doors, Lincoln wrestled with an idea he had carried cautiously for years: emancipation. Not as a moral gesture alone, but as a strategic necessity. Slavery was not just a Southern institution. It was the engine driving the Confederacy's economy, labor force, and war effort. Ending it would weaken the enemy, but it would also change everything. Lincoln knew the risks better than anyone. Emancipation could alienate border states still loyal to the Union. It could fracture Northern support. It could provoke backlash so intense that the war effort itself might collapse. This was the moment where everything could have fallen apart. Still, Lincoln believed something deeper, that a war for union without freedom was hollow, that preserving a nation built on liberty while tolerating human bondage was a contradiction no victory could erase. In private, he drafted the proclamation slowly, carefully. Every word mattered. This was not poetry, it was power. He waited for the right moment, not out of hesitation, but out of realism. Issuing emancipation after a defeat would look like weakness, desperation, empty moralism. He needed leverage. That moment came barely after the bloody stalemate at Antietam in September 1862. It wasn't a clear victory, but it stopped Confederate momentum. It gave Lincoln cover. Days later, he announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some celebrated, others recoiled. Abolitionists praised him, but many said it was too late, too limited, too cautious. Conservatives accused him of overreach. Soldiers questioned why they were now fighting to free people they had been told the war wasn't about. And the South, they raged. Lincoln was now framed as a revolutionary, a tyrant, a destroyer of the social order. Confederate resolve hardened. The war did not slow, it intensified. Still, Lincoln pressed forward. On January 1, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in Confederate-held territories. It did not free everyone. It did not end slavery overnight, but it changed the moral character of the war. From that moment on, the Union was no longer just fighting to survive. It was fighting to redefine itself. Lincoln understood the limits of what he had done. He never pretended otherwise. The proclamation was a wartime measure, narrow, conditional, and legally fragile, but it opened a door that could not be closed. Black men began joining the Union Army by the tens of thousands. Formerly enslaved people fled plantations, seeking refuge behind Union lines. The war's human stakes became impossible to ignore, and with that came new pressure. Racism in the North did not vanish with emancipation. White soldiers questioned fighting alongside black troops. Northern cities erupted in riots, most violently in New York City in 1863, where mobs attacked black citizens and protested the draft. The backlash was brutal. Lincoln absorbed it all. He faced criticism from every side. Too radical, not radical enough, too slow, too fast, too cautious, too reckless. The contradictions were endless, and still he held his course. Privately, Lincoln wrestled with the human cost of his decision. Emancipation made the war longer, harder, and bloodier. He knew it. But he also knew this: a peace built on slavery would never last. A union preserved without justice would rot from the inside. In November 1863, Lincoln traveled to a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery. The battle there had been catastrophic, tens of thousands killed in 3 days. Standing before the graves, Lincoln spoke for just 2 minutes. But those words reshaped the meaning of the war. He spoke of a nation conceived in liberty, of a test to see whether such a nation could endure, of the living's obligation to finish the work the dead had begun. Freedom, equality, purpose. He did not mention the Emancipation Proclamation directly. He didn't need to. Its meaning was already woven into the war's soul. The pressure on Lincoln never eased. Political enemies prepared to unseat him. Some within his own party believed emancipation had gone too far. Others believed he hadn't gone far enough. The upcoming election loomed, threatening to undo everything. And yet, Lincoln did not retreat. He began pushing quietly for something even more dangerous: a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery entirely. Not as a wartime measure, not as executive power, but as law, permanent, irreversible. This was no longer about survival alone. This was about transformation. The Emancipation Proclamation had not made Lincoln popular. It had made him necessary. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The war could no longer end with compromise. Too much had been named. Too much had been sacrificed. Lincoln knew the cost. He carried it anyway. It was about choosing the harder truth when easier lies were still available. He could have preserved the Union and left slavery untouched. Instead, he chose to risk everything: his presidency, his reputation, his life, to push the nation towards something it had never fully been: free. And in doing so, he ensured that even if the war destroyed him, it would not be meaningless. Because from that moment on, the struggle was no longer just about survival. It was about who America was willing to become. By the time he reached the final years of the Civil War, victory no longer felt like relief. It felt like exhaustion. The nation looked to him as a symbol, steady, unbreakable, resolute. Newspapers printed his speeches. Soldiers carried his words into battle. History was already shaping him into a monument. But inside the White House, behind closed doors, Lincoln was unraveling. He had always known darkness. Long before the presidency, long before the war, Lincoln had battled what he called his melancholy. Today, we would call it depression, deep, recurring, and relentless. It wasn't sadness. It was a weight, a heaviness that never fully lifted. The war didn't create it. The war amplified it. Every morning brought casualty reports, lists of names, numbers so large they blurred into abstraction, yet personal enough to haunt him. Every decision meant lives lost. Every delay meant more graves. Lincoln read the reports himself. He insisted on it. He believed that if he was asking men to die, he owed them the respect of knowing what it cost. That belief nearly broke him. The White House became a place of constant mourning. Families arrived begging for pardons, exemptions, mercy. Mothers collapsed at his feet. Fathers wept openly. Lincoln listened to all of it, absorbed it, rarely turned anyone away. He carried their grief home with him every night, and at home, grief was already waiting. In February 1862, his son Willie Lincoln, just 11 years old, fell violently ill, likely typhoid fever. The White House water supply was contaminated. Disease moved easily through the building, unseen and unstoppable. Lincoln watched his child weaken day by day. There was no power he could wield here. No proclamation, no order, no army that could fight this enemy. Willie died in the White House. The President of the United States collapsed. Witnesses said Lincoln wept openly, uncontrollably. He returned to the room where Willie had died again and again, standing silently, staring at the bed. He told friends he felt as if I had lost the anchor of my life. Mary Lincoln shattered completely. She blamed herself. She blamed the house. She blamed fate. She spiraled into grief so intense it frightened those around her. She held seances, desperate to hear her son's voice again. She screamed. She accused. She withdrew. Lincoln tried to hold her together while barely holding himself together. He had lost a child before, little Eddie, years earlier. But this loss cut deeper. Willie had been close to him, curious, thoughtful, unusually mature. Lincoln saw himself in the boy. Now that reflection was gone. The war did not pause. Meetings continued. Decisions pressed in. Generals argued. Congress demanded answers. The public watched closely for weakness. There was no space to grieve. Lincoln went back to work with hollow eyes and slumped shoulders. Those who knew him well saw the change. He aged visibly. His face grew gaunt, his posture heavier. His humor, once a lifeline, became rarer, darker. He slept little. He walked the halls at night, alone, replaying decisions that could never be undone. And still, the pressure mounted. The war dragged on longer than anyone expected. Victories were costly. Defeats were humiliating. Generals failed him repeatedly. Some were cautious to the point of paralysis. Others were reckless with men's lives. Lincoln fired them one by one. Each dismissal felt like an admission of failure. He questioned himself constantly. Was he asking too much? Was he moving too slowly? Was emancipation a mistake? Was the country tearing itself apart beyond repair? These doubts did not weaken his resolve, but they consumed his peace. Political enemies sensed blood in the water. Newspapers attacked his leadership, his appearance, his intelligence. They called him a dictator, a butcher, a joke. Some openly hoped for his death. Threats arrived daily. Security was minimal. Lincoln refused most protection. He believed isolation was more dangerous than exposure. That a president who hid from his people had already lost them. Inside, however, he was isolating anyway. He withdrew emotionally, spoke less, smiled less. When he did laugh, it was brief, almost apologetic, as if joy itself felt inappropriate while the nation suffered. Yet something remarkable happened in this darkness. Lincoln deepened. Suffering stripped him of illusion. It sharpened his empathy. He spoke more plainly, more honestly. He stopped pretending leadership was glorious. He began to speak openly about sacrifice, loss, and unfinished work. He accepted that the war might cost him everything, including his sanity, including his life. Still, he refused to let grief harden him. He visited wounded soldiers personally, shaking hands with men missing limbs, listening to stories no one else wanted to hear. He lingered in hospitals long after AIDS urged him to leave. He wrote letters to families of the fallen carefully, personally, often late at night. He chose words with precision, knowing they might be read for generations. In one such letter, he admitted there was nothing he could say to ease the pain. That honesty mattered. Lincoln did not claim strength he didn't feel. That vulnerability became his quiet power. Mary Lincoln's condition worsened under the strain. Her grief turned volatile. Public scandals erupted around her spending and behavior. Critics mocked her mercilessly, and by extension, him. Lincoln defended her fiercely. Privately, he worried constantly. He was losing control on every front: military, political, personal. And yet, the country endured. Not because Lincoln was invincible, but because he was willing to keep going while broken. By late 1864, the election approached. Many believed Lincoln would lose. Even he expected defeat at times. The war had exhausted the nation. Peace factions grew louder. Compromise seemed tempting. But Lincoln would not trade peace for the preservation of slavery. He had come too far, lost too much. He carried the weight of Willie's death, of every soldier lost, of a nation cracked open by its own contradictions. That weight bent him, but it did not stop him. This chapter of Lincoln's life is not about strategy or speeches. It is about endurance, about waking up every day under crushing sorrow and choosing responsibility anyway, about leading while grieving, about holding together a nation when your own family is falling apart. This was the Lincoln history rarely romanticizes. The man alone at night, the father who buried his child, the husband watching his wife unravel, the leader absorbing hatred so others could hope. This was not greatness forged in victory. It was greatness forged in grief, and the cost was written across his face. The storm was not over. But Lincoln had learned something essential in the darkness. Strength is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to carry it, so others don't have to. By early 1865, the war was ending. But he did not feel relief. He felt the full weight of what came next. The Confederacy was collapsing. Union armies were closing in from every direction. Richmond, the Confederate capital, would soon fall. The guns were growing quieter, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise ever was. Victory, Lincoln understood, was only the beginning of a far more dangerous chapter. Because winning the war was easier than winning the peace. And Lincoln knew it. 4 years of bloodshed had torn the nation apart. Families shattered. Cities burned. Over 600,000 dead. Hatred had sunk deep into the American soil. And now, as the fighting slowed, the country turned its eyes toward one man. What now, Mr. President? How do you stitch together a nation that tried to kill itself? Lincoln carried that question everywhere. Into meetings, into letters, into his dreams. The pressure was no longer just military. It was moral, historical, and deeply personal. He refused vengeance. That alone made him dangerous. Many in the North wanted punishment. Harsh terms, executions, permanent humiliation of the South. They wanted to make sure the rebellion could never rise again. Lincoln wanted something else. He wanted reconciliation. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said. Those were not empty words. They were a warning. Lincoln understood that cruelty after victory would plant the seeds for the next war. He believed peace built on humiliation would never hold. This belief isolated him. Radical Republicans in Congress saw his approach as weakness. Former Confederates saw it as manipulation. Extremists on both sides despised him. He stood alone again. As Union troops marched deeper into Virginia, Lincoln did something unprecedented. He went to the front lines himself. He walked through the ruins of Richmond after its fall, almost unguarded. Former slaves knelt before him in disbelief. Lincoln told them not to kneel. He had not come as a conqueror. He had come as a servant of the people. That moment captured the paradox of Lincoln's leadership. To millions, he was already a legend. To himself, he was simply a man trying to prevent the future from becoming another tragedy. Inside the White House, discussions turned to Reconstruction, how to bring Southern states back into the Union. Lincoln pushed for leniency, quick reintegration, loyalty oaths, a path forward, not backward. Every decision felt like a minefield. Go too soft, and the North would revolt. Go too hard, and the South would never heal. And hovering over everything was the unresolved question of formerly enslaved people. Freedom had been declared, but freedom without protection was a lie. Lincoln knew this. He worried constantly about what would happen once the armies left. Would the South accept emancipation? Or would it simply reinvent oppression under a new name? He did not have all the answers. That haunted him. In private moments, Lincoln admitted uncertainty more openly than ever before. He spoke of God, fate, and the limits of human control. The war had humbled him. He no longer spoke as if history could be commanded, only guided imperfectly. On March 4, 1865, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address. It was not a victory speech. It was a confession. He spoke of slavery as a shared national sin, of war as divine punishment, of humility in the face of suffering. The crowd expected celebration. They received reflection. Many did not understand it, but history would. This speech revealed a man no longer intoxicated by power, if he ever had been. Lincoln stood before the nation stripped of illusion, carrying scars both visible and hidden. He did not promise easy healing. He promised effort, patience, and moral courage. Behind the scenes, threats intensified. Lincoln was warned repeatedly that he was in danger. Assassination plots circulated. Security remained inadequate. He refused to live in fear. Some close to him believed he had a strange sense of finality, like a man who knew his time was short. He spoke often of death, not dramatically, but calmly, as if he had already made peace with the idea. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The war was over. The country erupted in celebration. Lincoln did not. He smiled, yes. He felt relief, yes. But his thoughts immediately turned to the fragile days ahead. Reconstruction loomed. Political battles were coming. The hardest work was not behind him, it was waiting. That same week, Lincoln spoke excitedly about plans for the future. He wanted education for formerly enslaved people, protection of their rights, a nation rebuilt without bitterness. He believed time was finally on his side. He was wrong. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater. He almost didn't go. He was tired, drained, but he agreed, hoping for a moment of normalcy. It would be his last. He sat in the presidential box, relaxed for the first time in months. The audience laughed. The war was over. The future seemed open again. Then, in an instant, everything collapsed. A gunshot. Close. Final. The man who had carried the weight of a nation through its darkest hour fell forward, mortally wounded. He never regained consciousness. As Lincoln was carried across the street, the country unknowingly crossed into a new era, without the one man most capable of guiding it through. He died the next morning, April 15, 1865. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Shock, grief, panic. The nation went silent. Church bells rang. People wept openly in the streets. For many Americans, it felt like losing a father. For others, a protector. For history, an irreplaceable voice. Lincoln did not live to see Reconstruction. He did not live to protect the fragile peace he envisioned. He did not live to finish the work. And that absence would shape everything that followed. This chapter of his life, his final days, reveals a cruel truth. Lincoln did not die at the peak of power. He died at the peak of responsibility, when the burden was heaviest, when his vision was clearest, when the country needed him most. He was not taken because the struggle was over. He was taken because the struggle was unfinished, and the cost of his absence would echo for generations. This was the final burden he carried, not just saving the Union, but believing it could still be saved after him. Abraham Lincoln's death did not feel real to the nation. It felt impossible. For 4 years, Americans had watched him carry the unbearable. They had seen his face age and fast forward, his eyes sink deeper with every casualty report, his voice steady even as the country screamed. He had become a constant in chaos. The one figure people believed would still be standing when the smoke cleared. And then, suddenly, he was. When Lincoln died in the early hours of April 15, 1865, the war had just ended, but the nation collapsed anyway. Not into violence, into grief. It was as if the country realized, all at once, what it had lost. The news spread faster than anything America had known before. Church bells rang in mourning. Businesses closed. Black cloth draped buildings and homes. Strangers wept together in the streets. Soldiers who had survived years of combat broke down openly. This was not political grief. This was personal. People felt abandoned. Lincoln's body lay in state as tens of thousands filed past in silence. His funeral train traveled across the country, retracing his journey to Washington years earlier. Except now, the cheers were gone. In their place were bowed heads, tears, and disbelief. In cities and small towns alike, people stood along the tracks for hours just to glimpse the coffin. They did not see a president. They saw a man who had absorbed the nation's pain and paid for it with his life. But grief was only the beginning, because Lincoln's death didn't just end a life. It changed the future. Andrew Johnson, his successor, lacked Lincoln's moral authority, patience, and vision. Reconstruction, already fragile, became chaotic and punitive. Instead of reconciliation guided by empathy, the country lurched toward bitterness, resentment, and unfinished justice. Lincoln had wanted healing. What followed was division without guidance. The South resisted change. The North grew impatient. Formerly enslaved people freed in law, but not in safety, were left vulnerable. Violence, intimidation, and discrimination surged. The promise Lincoln envisioned slipped further away with every passing year. Many historians would later say the same thing in different words. If Lincoln had lived, America might have healed differently. But history doesn't deal in maybes. It deals in consequences. And Lincoln's absence became one of the most consequential voids in American history. Yet, even in death, Lincoln continued to shape the nation. Because his words outlived his body, his speeches, simple, honest, unpretentious, became moral reference points. The Gettysburg Address, the second inaugural, letters written late at night under crushing pressure. These were not polished performances. They were confessions from a man trying to do right in a broken world. Lincoln never claimed perfection. That's why people trusted him. He admitted uncertainty. He acknowledged failure. He spoke openly about moral responsibility. He refused easy answers. And in doing so, he redefined leadership not as dominance, but as endurance. Over time, Lincoln became something larger than himself, a symbol. But that symbol is often misunderstood. He is carved into stone now, quoted on currency, reduced to slogans, stripped of struggle, sanitized. The real Lincoln was not a myth. He was anxious. He was depressed. He was often unsure. He failed more times than he succeeded until the moment it mattered most. That's the legacy that truly matters. Lincoln's greatness was not in victory. It was in persistence. He showed that leadership doesn't require certainty, only conviction. That moral courage often means standing alone. That doing What's right may cost you everything. He never sought glory. He never chased power. He never believed himself destined for greatness. He simply refused to quit when quitting would have been easier. Lincoln's life proves something uncomfortable and essential. Greatness is not clean. It is not confident. It is not born. It is built through loss, pressure, doubt, and pain. He did not live to see the America he imagined, but he gave it a direction. He bent the moral arc just enough for others to continue the work. That work remains unfinished, and maybe that's the point. Lincoln's story does not end with triumph. It ends with responsibility passed forward to every generation that inherits the struggle, to every moment where breaking feels easier than enduring, to every choice between convenience and conscience. This is why he still matters, not because he was perfect, but because he carried the weight anyway. Not because he won every battle, but because he refused to abandon the fight. Not because he survived, but because he showed us how to struggle without losing our humanity. And that is why his story belongs on Struggle versus Survival. Because Lincoln was never just a success story. He was a survival story. A man pushed beyond limits by history, power, violence, poverty, and fate. A man who stood at the edge of collapse and chose responsibility over relief. A man who proved that breaking is not an option, even when the cost is everything. The struggle did not end with him. It began because of him.